cabin that I assigned to them. We let them come out and go supper. But I went back and forth between them. And eventually, we reached the last day that we had to go home, and we were not successful. And we thought that we would have to go back to Washington and announce to the world that our effort had been unsuccessful. There were some extremely difficult final issues, which I won't have time to describe to you. But the most important of which was that Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister, had taken an oath before God that he would never eliminate or dismantle an Israeli settlement. And one of the major settlements was on Egyptian territory, just south of the Gaza Strip. And we had given up. Begin sent me word that he knew we had taken a photograph of the three of us. And he wanted to take some copies of that photograph home to his grandchildren. And he asked me to sign the photograph. Instead of just doing that, my secretary, Susan Cloud, got the name of Begin's 8 grandchildren. And I personalized each photograph with love to so-and-so. And I took them over to Begin's cabinet. He would hardly speak to me. And I gave the photographs to him, and he began to look at the photographs one by one, and he'd call out the name of each of his grandchildren. And he was a very tough guy, but tears began to come down his cheek as he thought about his grandchildren still living in a state of war. And he finally said, in effect, let's try again. So we worked out a deal, so Begin didn't have to make the decision to dismantle the settlement. It would be made by the Knesset, the parliament. And he agreed to stay out of the process. And the whole Camp David Accord was approved with 85% of the votes in the Israeli Knesset or parliament. And it called for a complete withdrawal of Israeli political forces and military forces from the West Bank and Gaza, and for full autonomy for the Palestinians, and other things. It's all in the book that I've written. So that was the end of the Camp David Accords, but we began to negotiate the details of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And almost exactly 29 years ago, just a couple of weeks ago, was the anniversary, we finally concluded that peace agreement. Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai. Egypt agreed to let Israeli ships go through the Suez Canal, and so forth. And it was confirmed, and in the last 29 years, and almost a month, not a single person has lost their life, not a single word of that agreement has been violated. Well, that was one of the high points of my life. And we're still very interested in this region, and in the fact that in the last 30 years, since the Camp David Accords were agreed to in 1978, very little progress has been made. The only progress in tangible terms has been that Jordan followed in the footsteps of Egypt. But the Israelis are still building settlements in Palestinian territory. Since the conference in Annapolis, they've announced 9,000 new settlements. There are more roadblocks now than there were when the Annapolis Convention meeting convened last November. And peace talks are ongoing. Nobody knows whether they're making progress or not. And so this is a very difficult thing for us to face. A couple of years ago, I decided to write a book, which David mentioned, that is controversial, primarily not because of its text, but because of its name. I named it Palestine, Peace, no punctuation marks, not apartheid. But the word apartheid was very controversial, and I wasn't completely surprised when it did arouse some controversy in my country. But the fact was that before that, there was no debate of any kind in the Congress or in political circles or in the news media about the Middle East peace process. No debate. And there hadn't been a single day of peace talks for over 6 years. So at least my vote did precipitate some discussion and some arguments and some criticism of me because of the use of the word apartheid. I made it plain that the word applied to what was happening in in the Palestinian territories, or Palestine as I call it. And my definition of apartheid is that it's when two people occupy the same land, when they are rigidly separated one from another, segregated, and when one of those parties completely dominates and persecutes the other. And that's an exact description of what is happening in Palestine now. My prayer is that we'll move forward to some sort of resolution. And that the efforts now being sponsored by President Bush and President Lisa Rice, the Secretary of State, and others will be successful. One of the premises that I have always assumed, I've negotiated many agreements around the world and tried some others that didn't come out, has been that you can't have an agreement that must involve certain parties unless you're willing to talk to those parties while you conclude the agreement. And I don't think anybody would doubt that in order to have peace in the Holy Land, you have to have involved Hamas, which won the election, as you know, in January 2006, got 44% of the votes and a majority of the parliament members. They have to be involved in some way in the final peace agreement. And also Syria, because Israel is occupying the Golan Heights, which everybody agrees, even the Israelis belong to Syria. But it's impossible now, under these circumstances, for the United States and Israel to talk to Hamas or to talk to Syria. So they have laid down a rule to which I consider myself immune, that you can't, nobody can talk to Hamas, nobody can talk to Syria. So my wife Rosa and Dr. Pass and I decided that we would take a trip. So we started already in Israel. When I arrived there, as someone who brought them peace with Egypt, I found that no member of the Israeli government would speak to me. I won't go into detail about it, but it didn't break my heart. It added a kind of some excitement and spice to the trip, which was more interesting. And we were well received by others in Israel. And then we've been in the West Bank to meet with the leaders there. And now in Egypt. And this afternoon I met with a group of Hamas leaders who came from Gaza up here under the auspices of the Egyptian government. Tomorrow